Let me tell you something that no one in the mainstream church wants to say out loud. We are not waiting for the storm. The storm is already here. I have been an exorcist for over 2 decades. Well, I have sat across from demons. I have heard them speak. And I am telling you right now, with absolute theological precision, with the full weight of sacred scripture, with the authority of tradition behind every word I say, something has shifted. Something in the spiritual realm has changed, and the average Catholic sitting in the pew on Sunday morning has absolutely no idea what is happening around them. The darkness is not coming. It is already here. It has already been unleashed. And the worst part? Most people, even most devout Catholics, are completely dangerously unprepared. I'm not here to scare you. I'm here to tell you the truth. Because the truth is the only thing that will save you right now. Not feelings, not optimism, not the false peace that says everything is fine. Just keep going to Mass and you'll be okay. No, you need to understand what is happening spiritually, doctrinally, and practically, because the battle has already begun and your soul, your family's souls, are in the crosshairs. In the next few minutes, I'm going to take you through 6 devastating realities that most Catholics have never been taught. I'm going to show you what the Church Fathers knew, what the great mystics warned about, what the saints prepared for, and what you need to do right now. Because once you understand what has already begun, you will never look at your spiritual life the same way again. Let's begin. Let me start with something that every serious exorcist in the world is noticing, and almost no bishop is willing to talk about publicly. The number of possession cases, oppression cases, diabolical obsession cases has exploded. I am not speaking in metaphors. I am speaking in statistics, in data, in raw, undeniable pastoral reality. Priests who do this work, and there are far fewer of us than there should be, are overwhelmed. There are waiting lists. People are suffering for months, sometimes years, waiting for help that the church should be equipped to give immediately. Why is this happening? Why now? Because the conditions that invite demonic activity, the spiritual, moral, and cultural conditions, have never been more perfectly aligned in the history of Western civilization. Think about what has happened in our culture. We have normalized occultism. We have put it in our children's entertainment. We have made witchcraft trendy. We have popularized Ouija boards, tarot cards, astrology, and crystals, things that sacred scripture explicitly forbids. And we have rebranded them as spiritual wellness. We have built an entire billion-dollar industry around what God calls an abomination. Where is the church in all of this? In too many cases, the church has been silent, or worse, accommodating. Now let me give you the theological foundation, because this is not just pastoral panic. This is doctrine. The Second Vatican Council's Declaration on Religious Freedom, while valid in its proper context, was misapplied in a way that caused widespread confusion about the unique salvific role of the Catholic Church. When people stopped believing that the church was the exclusive means of salvation, when relativism crept into the pews, they also stopped believing in the seriousness of sin. When they stopped believing in the seriousness of sin, they stopped protecting themselves. And the devil, who is a real being, a personal being, an angelic intelligence of extraordinary power who hates you specifically, individually, by name, the devil walked right in. Now, I need you to understand something about how demonic activity works, because there is dangerous popular ignorance on this point. Possession is rare. Let's be precise. Full possession, where a demon takes complete control of a person's body and faculties, is the least common form of diabolical attack. It requires either explicit invitation or extraordinary divine permission, but oppression, obsession, infestation, these are far more common than anyone wants to admit. Oppression means external attack. The demon is working from outside, hammering the person's will, imagination, and emotions. Persistent depression that has no natural cause. Inexplicable rage. Compulsions towards sin that feel overpowering. Thoughts that come with a force and a darkness that the person cannot account for. Obsession means the demon is working on the mind, injecting thoughts, creating fixations, wearing down the intellect's relationship with truth. A person who was once devout suddenly finds prayer impossible. Scripture feels hollow. The sacraments feel distant. This is not always a crisis of faith. Sometimes it is a crisis of warfare. Infestation means the demonic has attached itself to a place, an object, or a situation. And in our culture, where occult objects are sold in mainstream stores, where people casually bring home items with dark histories, where entire neighborhoods have been soaked in decades of grave sin, infestation is an epidemic. Here is what the veil thinning means in practical terms. In previous eras of Christian civilization, there was a kind of cultural armor. The prayers of the church, the exorcisms in the old baptismal rite, the prayers over the home, the angelus rung from church bells, the constant rhythm of liturgical life, all of these created a kind of spiritual infrastructure, a defense. The demonic was active. Yes, it is always active, but it was constrained. That armor has been stripped away. The old prayers were abandoned. The exorcisms were softened. The bells fell silent. The angelus was forgotten. The holy water fonts went dry. The scapulars came off. The rosaries went into drawers. And nature, spiritual nature, abhors a vacuum. When the church retreated from its role as the spiritual guardian of civilization, something else moved in to fill that space. When what moved in was not neutral, it was not merely secular. It was actively demonic, because the demonic hates the vacuum no less than nature does. I want you to sit with this for a moment, because I am not being dramatic. I am being precise. The ancient fathers of the church, men like Origen, Tertullian, John Chrysostom, Augustine, wrote extensively about the way demonic powers operate through culture, through institutions, through the invisible structures of society. They called these the principalities and powers that St. Paul identifies in Ephesians 6. These are not metaphors for bad ideas. These are real spiritual beings with real power over real systems. When an entire culture turns away from God, when it legalizes the murder of the innocent, when it enshrines perversion as virtue, when it mocks the sacred and elevates the profane, it does not merely become morally worse, it becomes spiritually occupied. The principalities take up residence, and their influence flows downward through every institution, every screen, every classroom, into the homes, into the families, into the souls of the children. This is not conspiracies. This is theology. This is what the church has always taught. Well, and here is the terrifying part. Most Catholics have no idea this is happening to them. They are being spiritually assaulted every single day through their phones, through their entertainment, through their schools, through the ambient culture, and they have been so poorly catechized that they don't even have the categories to recognize it. They think they have anxiety. They think they have depression. They think they have relationship problems or career stress. And sometimes, yes, those are natural causes. But sometimes, more often than any psychologist or psychiatrist is trained to consider, something else is going on. The veil has thinned. The demonic is no longer hiding. And the first step to protecting yourself and your family is simply to believe that I want to say something that is going to be deeply uncomfortable for a lot of people. And I say it not to cause despair, but because the truth, even painful truth, is the only foundation on which we can build the great apostasy that Scripture warned about. The mass falling away from the faith. It is not a future event on some prophetic calendar. It is the present reality. We are living inside it right now. Let me give you numbers, because I think some people still need to hear them. In 1960, roughly 75% of Catholics in the United States attended Mass weekly. Today, by the most generous estimates, that number is somewhere between 17% and 22%. That means that in the span of 60 years, within living memory, the practicing Catholic population collapsed by more than 2/3. But it's not just Mass attendance. Confession has virtually disappeared. Sacramental marriage is at historic lows. Catholic schools have largely become indistinguishable from secular schools. The number of priests has been cut nearly in half. The number of religious sisters has collapsed by over 70%. Entire dioceses that once had thriving Catholic culture are now ecclesiastical wastelands. This is not a slow decline. This is a catastrophic collapse. And by any serious theological analysis, it fits the description of what St. Paul calls the apostasia, the falling away, that he warns about in his second letter to the Thessalonians. Now, I want to be very careful here because I'm not making prophetic claims beyond my competence. I am not saying we are in the final days. I am not date setting. I am making a theological and historical observation. The conditions that Scripture and tradition associate with the most serious crisis of faith in history are present. They are measurable. They are documented when they are being ignored by the very shepherds whose job it is to sound the alarm. Why have we arrived here? There are many causes. But I want to focus on the deepest one because it is the one that most Catholic commentators are afraid to name. The crisis in the Church is primarily a crisis of prayer. Not of doctrine, though doctrine has certainly been confused. Not of liturgy, though the liturgical rupture has caused devastating damage. Not of leadership, though weak and worldly leadership has compounded every other problem. At the root of everything is a collapse of interior prayer life. And specifically, the collapse of contemplative, sacrificial, demanding prayer, the kind of prayer that costs something, that requires silence and time and the death of the ego. The modern Catholic has been told, subtly and persistently, that what matters is community, social justice, being a good person, and showing up to church occasionally. The interior life, the life of grace, the mystical relationship with the Trinity, the cultivation of virtue, the genuine combat with sin has been functionally abandoned by large portions of the catechetical enterprise. And without interior prayer, the sacraments become empty rituals. Without interior prayer, the Christian life becomes mere moralism. Without interior prayer, the person is unprotected, unformed, and unequipped for the spiritual battle. The saints were not holy because they had good values. The saints were holy because they prayed ceaselessly, sacrificially. They wrestled with God in prayer, the way Jacob wrestled with the angel, refusing to let go until they received the blessing. They fasted. They kept vigil. They practiced penance. They took seriously the words of Christ. This kind does not go out except by prayer and fasting. That kind of discipleship has been quietly edged out of mainstream Catholic life, and into the space it vacated has rushed worldliness, compromise, and ultimately apostasy. Now, here is what I want you to understand about the spiritual significance of apostasy, because this is where it gets truly frightening. Every soul that falls away from the faith does not simply become neutral. A baptized Catholic who abandons the faith does not return to some innocent pre-Christian state. Baptism marks the soul permanently. The graces that were given and rejected do not simply disappear. They cry out. And the soul that has been marked by Christ and then turns away becomes, in a very real theological sense, more vulnerable, not less, to diabolical influence. This is why we see so many people leaving the church and immediately falling into the most serious forms of occultism, sexual disorder, nihilism, from despair. It is not a coincidence. It is a spiritual law. When the soul that was claimed by Christ is abandoned by its guardian, the enemy moves in with 7 demons worse than the first. This is not my invention. These are the words of the Lord himself in the Gospel of Matthew. The great apostasy is not a future catastrophe to be avoided. It is a present reality to be survived. And the only way to survive it, personally, familially, parochially, is radical fidelity, not the cultural Catholicism of grandparents who went to Mass out of habit, but the radical, cost-counting, cross-embracing, saint-aspiring fidelity that the Church has always demanded of her true children in times of crisis. You cannot coast through this moment in history. The spiritual coasting option has been removed from the table. You are either going to go deeper into Christ or you are going to drift away. There is no comfortable middle. The current is too strong. And this is actually good news if you have eyes to see it. Because crisis is clarifying. The lukewarm are being sifted. The comfortable are being forced to choose. And those who choose Christ now, with full knowledge of what it costs, will be forged into something extraordinary. The great apostasy is already here. But so is the great remnant. When which one you belong to depends entirely on what you do next. I want to talk to every parent listening to me right now, because what I'm about to say is the most urgent thing I will say in this entire presentation. Your children are the primary target, not you. Your children. The demonic strategy in this moment of history is specifically, deliberately, surgically aimed at the generation now between the ages of 6 and 25, when it is working with a precision and efficiency that should terrify every Catholic parent to their core. Let me explain why children are the target. Because it is theologically logical. The demon cannot force a mature adult to abandon a well-formed faith by a single assault. A Catholic who has been properly formed, who has a deep prayer life, a sacramental life, a genuine understanding of doctrine, is spiritually resilient. You can attack that person, you can cause suffering, you can create confusion, but you cannot simply override their will. But a child who has not yet been properly formed, who has not yet developed the intellectual and spiritual muscles to resist, who is surrounded by peers who are all receiving the same messages. Who trusts their devices and their entertainers more than their parents? That child is extraordinarily vulnerable. And the enemy knows it. What is happening to our children right now is the most systematic spiritual assault on a generation in the history of humanity. I do not say that hyperbolically. I say it as a trained theologian who has studied demonology, who understands the way principalities work through culture, and who has spent decades watching what happens to people when the spiritual foundation is destroyed in childhood. Look at what they are being given. From the earliest ages, they are immersed in content that normalizes the occult, that presents gender ideology as settled science, that mocks Christianity as primitive and bigoted, that sexualizes childhood, that promotes nihilism and despair through its aesthetics, and that creates in them a deep, persistent anxiety that makes them desperate for relief in any form, including the most disordered forms. The smartphone is not a neutral tool. In the hands of a child, it is an open portal to everything the demonic needs to access the imagination. The imagination, Thomas Aquinas understood this deeply, is the gateway to the will. If you control what a person imagines, you begin to control what a person desires. And if you control what a person desires, you control the direction of their soul. The entertainment industry is not producing content for children out of innocent commercial motivation. There is an ideological agenda, and that agenda is the systematic destruction of Christian anthropology. The destruction of the understanding that the human person is made in the image and likeness of God, With a definite nature, we're a definite purpose and a definite supernatural destiny. When you replace that vision with the message that you are whatever you feel, that there is no fixed truth, that the body is a prison from which you must escape, that death is just the end and nothing matters, you are not just teaching bad ideas. You are spiritually disarming a generation. And Catholic parents, God help us, in too many cases, have handed their children directly to this machine. They have given them the devices. They have allowed the entertainment. They have sent them to the schools. They have let the culture do the catechesis because they did not have the formation to do it themselves, because their own catechesis was insufficient, because they too were failed by a church that retreated from its duty. I am not saying this to condemn parents. I am saying it to call them to wake up. There is still time. But the window is closing, and it is closing fast. What does it mean to reclaim your children from this assault? First, you must understand that it is a spiritual battle, not merely a cultural or political one. You cannot fight this with social media posts or political activism alone. Those things have their place, but they are not primary. The primary battle is supernatural. A home must become a domestic church again, not in a sentimental, decorative sense. A crucifix on the wall and a nativity at Christmas. I mean a home with a genuine prayer life, daily family rosary, regular family fasting, confession at least monthly for every member of the family, a rule of life, specific hours given to God each day. Second, the devices must be controlled. Not banned entirely, perhaps, though for many families that is actually the right answer, but controlled, monitored, limited. And before you give your child a device, you give them the spiritual formation that allows them to engage with a hostile digital environment without being destroyed by it. Third, the children must be given a vision worth fighting for. One of the reasons so many young Catholics leave the faith is that they have never been given the real, demanding, beautiful, costly vision of Christian discipleship. They have been given a comfortable, therapeutic, socially acceptable religion. And that is not enough to hold a young person who is being pulled by every force in the culture towards something that at least claims to offer meaning and identity and belonging. Give them the saints. Give them the mystics. Give them the martyrs. Give them Joan of Arc and Thomas More and Maximilian Kolbe. Give them something that is worth suffering for. Because the one thing this generation is not afraid of is suffering. They are already suffering. What they need is a context in which their suffering means something. Your children are under attack. This is not a metaphor. This is a spiritual reality. And your response to this reality is the most important parenting decision you will ever make. I need to say something now that is going to be very difficult, because I love the church with everything I have. And what I am about to say comes from love, not from cynicism, not from pride, not from any desire to undermine authority. It comes from the same place that compelled the prophets to speak uncomfortable truth to the leaders of Israel. There is a crisis in the Catholic hierarchy. It is not hidden, it is not a fringe theory. It is documented, measurable, and devastating in its consequences. And the Catholic faithful have a right to know about it, not in order to despise their shepherds, but in order to understand the situation they are actually in. And to respond appropriately, the Second Vatican Council was a legitimate council of the Church, and its documents, properly interpreted in continuity with tradition, contain genuine pastoral wisdom. I want to be clear about that. But the implementation of Vatican II, the so-called spirit of the council, was in many cases a catastrophe. Rupture was introduced into the life of the church that severed ordinary Catholics from their liturgical heritage, their doctrinal formation, their devotional life. and their understanding of what the church actually is and does. The new Mass, as it was implemented in most parishes in most of the world, was stripped of the prayers that most clearly expressed the sacrificial nature of the Eucharist. The offertory prayers, which were among the most theologically rich prayers in the entire liturgical tradition, were replaced with simplified forms. The prayers at the foot of the altar, the last gospel, the Confiteor in its full form, the prayers to the Holy Trinity that surrounded the distribution of communion, all of these were removed or minimized, and the result, and this is documented in the data, is not speculation, was a collapse of the understanding of the real presence. A 2019 Pew Research study found that only 31% of Catholics in the United States believe in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. 31%. That means nearly 7 out of 10 Catholics receiving communion do not believe they are receiving the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ. That is not a pastoral inconvenience. That is a catastrophe. Because if you do not believe in the real presence, you are receiving the most sacred reality in the universe without the faith required to receive it properly. And the consequences of that, spiritually, supernaturally, are severe. St. Paul warns in 1 Corinthians that those who receive the Eucharist unworthily eat and drink judgment to themselves. This is not a mild warning. This is an apostolic warning about spiritual danger of the highest order. And yet it is almost never preached from Catholic pulpits because the pastors themselves, in many cases, have been so formed by the post-conciliar therapeutic model of ministry that they have lost the theological vocabulary to preach it. Now, I want to address the abuse crisis because I cannot discuss the crisis in the hierarchy without addressing it. The sexual abuse of children and minors by clergy and the systematic cover-up of that abuse by bishops is not merely a moral failure, it is a supernatural sign. It is the fruit of a corruption that runs deeper than policy or psychology. Or it is the fruit of what happens when men who are called to be icons of Christ, who are given sacred authority over souls, use that authority for their own gratification and self-protection. This is exactly what the prophet Ezekiel describes when he speaks of shepherds who feed themselves while the flock starves and scatters. It is exactly what Christ warns against when he speaks of hirelings who flee when the wolf comes. And it has